Good day and welcome to CDI Talks. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov and I'm the chair of the Center for Democratic Integrity, an Austria-based NGO that analyzes attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics and societies in Europe. My guest today is the German economist Rebecca Schönenbach. Rebecca is the chairwoman of the Association Women for Freedom that is committed to maintaining and strengthening equality, as well as preventing violations of the principle of equality in the German society. Rebecca is also known as an expert on counter-terrorism and a certified specialist on Islamic finance, which has had a direct relationship to the topic of our conversation: Iran's malign influence in Europe and its assistance to Russia in escaping Western sanctions and international pressure. I hope you will find our conversation useful, and if you do, please like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay updated on future episodes of CDI Talks. Rebecca, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you. I would like to ask you the first question. In March this year, following the beginning of the full-blown invasion of Ukraine, there were reports that Iran offered to Russia to help to evade the sanctions that were imposed on the Russian Federation for its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. What would be the benefit for Iran with helping Russia to evade those sanctions?
Well, the benefit for Iran would be to have an ally again and to divide its enemies, because Russia and Iran have common interests, but they also have interests that don't align. But in securing Russia's complacency in dealing with Iran, Iran can make sure that it has no enemy on that front, because Russia is still a huge country. It could be dangerous for Iran. And of course there are economic benefits, because they both have a nuclear program. They benefit greatly not only from the weapons machinery of Iran, but also for the nuclear program for some components. They can exchange technical details, also concerning weapons, but also the air machines and so on. Whatever they need in technical machinery can be imported via Iran from China to Russia and vice versa. So it gives Iran an opportunity to have a larger market for its goods, also to refine oil, because Iran largely does not refine its crude oil themselves, but it has to export it and then it gets refined. Interestingly enough, in Russia, of course, Western companies refine oil, so it's a question if that will work, but still it's the hope of the Iranians. So there are there are several aspects. One is that it ensures that it's not going to be attacked by Russia, and the other one is an economic interest. And the third one is to divide the rest of the world. This is what Iranians do since more than 40 years. They sow discord between potential enemies of Iran to make sure that they cannot be attacked.
You mentioned the nuclear program of Iran, but as we all know, Israel is very much against the nuclear program of Iran, well, together obviously with the US and the EU, but Israel is, I think, the keystone here. But Russia also wants to have good relations with Israel. And Israel so far has not provided any military or any other assistance to Ukraine. So don't you think that Iran or Russia, by agreeing to cooperate with Iran, would lose Israel as its ally, or at least as a neutral country?
Israel has provided assistance to Ukraine. It has provided medical assistance, and nobody can be really sure if they have not provided intelligence. They're not going to say, but at least they haven't refused to provide what they can. The problem of Israel is that it needs Russian cooperation to defend itself against aggression from Syria, because the Russians control the airspace in Syria. So whenever Israel needs to take out Hezbollah activities and groups or other malign influences in Syria, it has to cooperate with Russia. And this is why they were so careful to openly voice their support. But they now condemned, just now they condemned the annexation of Ukrainian territories by Russia. So they made it clear that they're not totally neutral, but they have a stance against that. And so I don't think that Iran is afraid of the Russian-Iranian cooperation. I mean, anyway, Russia and Iran cooperated in Syria before, since 2015, in the wars in all the regions in the Middle East where both are meddling. They always cooperated. So there is already that triangle that Israel had to balance for itself, to defend itself between Russia and other nations. And this is why they're careful, but they're not saying we're on the Russian side, not at all.
There were some remarks made by the officials of the Russian Federation that some could consider even anti-Semitic. Do you think that, for example, Foreign Minister Lavrov said that, you know, Jews cooperated with Hitler, etc., etc. Do you think that it was somehow pro-Iranian remarks, you know, trying to deliver a message, to convey a message to Iran that we are somehow on your side?
It could be, but I think that there's enough anti-Semitism in Russia itself that they also attend to their own population. Anti-Semitism within Russia is a really big problem. And this is also why Bennett, when he was still prime minister before the change, tried to negotiate with the Russian government, with Putin himself. One of the main aims was to get as many Russian Jews out of the country before it really hits them, because they're going to be the first target within Russia. And you have seen the waves of Russian Jews leaving Russia in the 90s and now again, since 2014, when Russia first aggressed Ukraine, then there was a wave to Israel, and now it's again a wave trying to save themselves. So I think it's both. Maybe it was to cater to the Iranians, but I think it was more to cater to their
own audience.
To their own audience, because it resonates with them. And anyway, it's a very, very strange narrative to address Zelensky, who himself is a Jew, as a Nazi. And that is totally crazy, but it works somehow with the Russian propaganda that has been built up for years and years and years. To frame everybody who is against the Russian government as somewhat Nazi. And this is what they're trying to do, and this is why they appeal to anti-Semitic stereotypes so often. It's kind of a reframing of the narrative of after the Second World War, where Russia fought against the Nazis, and they did, but then they reframed the whole thing.
You know, I must tell you that it's already before the Second World War. There was an interpretation of fascism. They wouldn't call the German version of fascism National Socialism, because they thought it was fake socialists. But already then, they did consider German fascists to be primarily anti-Russian or anti-Soviet rather than anti-Semitic. This narrative has a very long history. This is why, well, if Zelensky is a Jew, it doesn't really matter. If he's considered to be anti-Russian, he's automatically a fascist. So this is the interpretation of what they have.
Ah, okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
But back to Iran. Obviously, I think we now see evidence that Iran probably is trying to help Russia in some way. What can be the main lines of Iran's assistance to Russia to circumvent the sanctions?
Well, since Iran is had to find ways to circumvent sanctions, it is very well trained to do that. And there's cooperation already before 2012, or we can trace it back to 2012, between Russian entities and Iranian entities laundering money together. Also Reza Zarrab, who's one of the biggest scandals. I mean, one of the money launderers working both for Russia and for Iran. He worked first for Russia and then for Iran. So there has been cooperation for quite a few years. And Iran established a financial network to circumvent sanctions that could be used by Russia. It is already being used by Russia, to be honest, but it could then be enlarged through their cooperation for both sides, and that would, of course, have effects for both of them.
In the beginning of April this year, Mohsen Karimi, deputy governor of the Central Bank of Iran for International Relations, apparently suggested that the anti-sanctions scheme used by Iran would remain in place even if the West lifted the sanctions. So do you think that there is some kind of a global illegal financial system in place that can help rogue nations and authoritarian regimes and terrorist regimes to operate?
It's not one system, it's many systems that overlap, and a lot of it is legal, because the main interest of money laundering and in evading sanctions is to get back into the legal system, because some things you can only buy on the legal market, or you can't conceal them. So you only can conceal your traces. And this is what they're doing. So it's not one system, it's different ways to circumvent sanctions. And we can point to a few countries, for example, the United Arab Emirates. They have been downgraded by the Financial Action Task Force, which is an international body to supervise the implementation against money laundering in countries. They have downgraded it in March this year to grey, which means they have to do something about money laundering and illicit finance, because it is one of the main hubs for Iran and Russia to evade sanctions. And they deal with Iranian banks, which is highly illegal. If you don't want to, you have to comply with US sanctions, which are still in place, because the US sanctions every company that deals with Iran and deals with the US. So these sanctions go further than only direct contacts to the US. So if a European company would deal with Iran, it would be sanctioned in the US. So this is why it really is a quite sharp knife. It really works. But still, they find ways. Then, of course, there are things like Bitcoin or other cyber cryptocurrencies, let's say. Bitcoin is one of the least problems, but they are ring-based cyber currencies which are not traceable. Then, of course, there are Hawala trades where you don't use the official money banking system. And all of these kind of things are already in place. And it's mainly the United Arab Emirates, it's Turkey, and a few other countries which facilitate these illegal deals and make it possible for Iran and Russia to evade sanctions. And through shadow companies, a lot of construction companies, in the case of Iran and Turkey, are front company then for Iranians. And this is how it works. But it's not like one system that is,
so it's
a separate
several
system.
Smaller systems.
It's their interest to get back into the legal side of the system, and this is how it works.
Is China using any of those systems?
Yes. It does not have to at the moment, not at the scale that Iran and Russia have to. And it's very, very careful not to mingle too much in it, but it has deals. It signed a memorandum of understanding. It signed several contracts with Iran. It's investing in Iran heavily. So for China, it's the same with Iran. It's balancing its powers. So it's making sure that nobody is on the wrong side, that they're secure from all the sides. So it's not that they support Iran or Russia, but they just make sure that they're not going to be attacked from this angle. But they're not going to violate sanctions on a big scale, not to get into trouble with the West. Not at the moment, maybe in a couple of years, but at the moment they just balance their power.
You mentioned Turkey, you mentioned Syria already, but we know that Iran also supports terrorist organizations, or organizations that are considered terrorist by some Western nations. And here is a question about Germany, because some would say that Germany has an Iran problem. Do you agree with this?
Yes.
Elaborate.
To put it brutally and directly, yes. I mean, you can see that at the moment, in the middle of the Iran protests, the last night was the worst night since the street protests started. They encircled the university with young students, hundreds of them. They killed protesters on the streets, so it's really, really a bloodbath going on at the moment in Iran. And we have seen that several German politicians made remarks which were quite in order, but it took a long time to get them there, and they're still not imposing what they could impose, which is sanctions. I mean, there's some sanctions in place, obviously, but there could be way more strict sanctions, and then they could expel the diplomats, which would really hurt Iran. They could close down some of the front organizations of the Iranian regime in Germany. They're all still there. They could expel the diplomats. All these things are possible right now, and they're not going to do it. And you can see that we have a few commentators from think tanks within the journalist field who since years and years promote the narrative of the Iranian regime that it's about economic grievances. So it's not about the repression by the Iranian government. It's not about the Islamist regime imposed on women. It's not about freedom, but their narrative is it's only about sanctions. And if you give them aid, if you lift the sanctions, if you give them economic aid and so on, then all will be good. So they try to somehow influence German politics in saying that it's not a structural problem. It has nothing to do with the regime. And this kind of narrative can be found a lot in political dialogue within Germany. And you could see that also with Russia, because it took Germany quite a long time, and we are still not there to provide the aid that Ukraine needs because of the lobbyists influencing German politics. And you can also see that it's the same politicians who cater to the Russian narrative, who cater to the Iranian narrative.
Probably Chinese as well.
China to some extent as well, but for example, our former economics minister and foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, he both initiated the Iranian politics, Iran politic like we call it, because he said there will be reforms in Iran. And he also catered quite a lot to the Russian narrative. And that is highly problematic.
How much of a problem is Iran's espionage activities in Germany?
It is a problem. They expelled, for example, 11 Iranian diplomats who targeted Jewish kindergartens and persons, for example, from the German-Israeli society, and planned attacks. Espionage and economic espionage is a problem because they used cyber attacks. They used servers in the Czech Republic to attack German companies. So there is quite a lot of espionage going on. I don't think it's as powerful as Chinese espionage. They're not on that same level, but there is a higher attack. Other than with the Chinese, there's a higher attack of terrorist attacks because it's interlinked with the Iranian regime, and it's not so much about stealing economic secrets. It's much more about threatening opposition, threatening anybody who speaks out against the Iranian regime. For example, a few of my colleagues got threats just 2 weeks ago and were put under police protection. That is quite common.
Colleagues based in Germany?
Based in Germany, yeah. So that happens every 5 to 6 months. And then, of course, we have Asadullah Assadi, who is the terrorist convicted to 20 years in prison, who sits now in Belgium in a prison. He went through Germany, visited a so-called mosque in Hamburg, and he made the mistake to write down all his transactions. So he paid out money to other agents and he wrote them down, not their clear name, but some pseudonyms. And so we have proof that some of them met in Hamburg in the mosque. So you can see that there's a link between the Iranian fronts with terrorism, connected with terrorism, and it is a real danger. If he would have carried out his attack, he would have killed more than 100 people in Paris.
You mentioned that some of the systems that help Iran and some other countries to evade the sanctions, to circumvent them, they also feature some legal entities. Mm-hmm. But if we're talking about influence, Iran's influence in Europe, are we talking about any legal measures that they can take to change some attitudes, European attitudes towards Iran? Because if we look at China, it's not all illegal what they're doing. They're using many legal opportunities, legal measures, legal instruments to influence politics as lobbyists. And lobbyism is not a criminal offense. Everybody is lobbying in Europe. So what about Iran? Or is it only about corruption? Or is there some legal aspect of what they're doing?
It's quite a lot of legal aspects. They're not as developed as the Chinese entities, but they also influence certain figures in think tanks, in NGOs. They have people in journalism and so on, and they have developed a very sophisticated system of news outlets, state-controlled news outlets. Some of them are known, like Press TV, but also some websites which are mainly catering to the Shiite communities within Europe, but also in Africa, largely in Africa, and in Latin America. For example, they developed some news sites, very similar to Sputnik, to the Russian influence, and it's one of the most, and the top 10 of the most frequented news sites in Latin America. So it's legal, it's not forbidden. It's not very obvious that it's state-controlled by the Iranians, but it influences public opinion. And in Germany itself, it's not that they can influence on a large scale, so they don't have a website where everybody clicks in the morning to get the latest news, but it's still good enough to influence quite a part of it, and to at the strategic points to influence public opinion, at least if it comes to the atomic energy deal, or if it comes to refugees, and how to deal with the Iranian regime, whether it's a threat to Europe or not. It's largely considered not a threat, although the proofs are there. It's still, most of the public would think it's not a threat. So it's also very interesting that all these attacks that happened in Burgas, there are more than 500 opposition figures killed in the last 40 years within foreign countries. And still it's not known publicly. It doesn't come to mind. If you mention Iran and the Iranian regime, most people would not think about terrorism within Europe.
You mentioned the use of media, you also mentioned some front organizations. What are other instruments of Iran's malign influence that you can identify in Europe?
There are mosques. I mean, there are religious institutions which have a religious function, but largely serve as political centers for the Iranian regime. They even invite youth for some trainings. They also directly convert a lot of Sunni youth, which, for example, was observed in Belgium, which is astonishing, but that's one of their targets. But they also train Muslims from Sunni communities to become journalists. They give them media training. They do events that cater to a large Muslim population, not to integrate into the West. So religious institutions are one thing. Then they have institutions called Al-Mustafa Institute, which is a double function of religious scholars, media training, studies, and so on. That also functions, they work like think tanks mostly in the West, trying to put out papers to influence public opinion. They have the websites that are giving advice to Shia, and they're not really identified as Iranian websites, but controlled by the Iranian state, and also putting out some of the Iranian narratives. And of course, then there's something like Press TV, and it works by engaging mostly Westerners, and they have kind of a serious image. A lot of them also work for Russia Today. Also there's some overlap between those prominent figures, and they influence both the left and the far right. And they also try to make contact by inviting both figures from the far left and the far right to Tehran, to conferences. That is the same that some of the Russian lobbyists do. It's not so much about paying money. Most of the time you won't, if you control the accounts of people, you won't find direct payments to people. But they deal in information and they deal in power relations. So you get into contact with powerful people from other countries if you visit those conferences. For example, in Tehran, there was the youth leader of the far-right AfD was invited to one of their conferences, and there was also Dugin, so the kind of ideologue of the far-right in Russia. And several other politicians, so it's about networking and putting each other in positions where you can reach a certain amount of influence.
With these political centers that you mentioned, I hope now to ask a very tricky question, really tricky question. Is it all these centers of influence via religious centers or that masquerade as religious centers? Are we talking about the spread of the Islamic Revolution, or are they simply trying to convince the population or convince societies to lift the sanctions against Iran? So are we talking about strategic or tactical moves of Iran's regime?
I think it's both. I mean, it is interesting that within the constitution of the Iranian regime, it states that they want to export the Islamist or Islamic revolution to the world. So that is the goal stated in the Iranian constitution. So that is the long-term goal. But on a tactical level, it's also about influencing the Muslim communities, mostly the Shiite Muslim communities, who are not necessarily Iranian. For example, in Nigeria, there's a large Shiite community. And they also use the local languages. So they have media outlets that mostly write and broadcast in local languages. So it's both, and they don't only report necessarily on Iranian topics, but also on topics that matter to Iran. And one of the things that we see on a tactical level is that they try to create diversions. So they try to divide countries that could be potentially unite against Iranian interests. And that might be on different topics, on migration, on economic topics, and so on. It could be anything that helps to get them into conflict and then be busy with fighting between each other and not attacking Iran.
Do you see any signs that Western nations are learning from their mistakes that they made while imposing sanctions on Iran?
Well, it seems that it takes Europeans quite a long time to learn. I mean, they had the chance to learn with the JCPOA when it was...
which is a nuclear deal with Iran.
Which is the nuclear deal with Iran in 2015. And it was supposed to contain the proliferation of the Iranian regime. It seems that did not work, although they claim that they only developed nuclear capabilities after 2018 when the US left the deal. But that's highly improbable that they haven't had those capabilities before and did not develop them over the years. We can see that within the missile program, they didn't comply to the deal. So overall, they didn't comply. Every time there was a deal, Iran profited and financed with the income the terrorist activities, not only in Europe, but also largely in countries like Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, and destabilized the region, which also led to refugees coming to Europe. And this is also, by the way, one of the threats that the Iranian regime is using against Europe. It threatens Europe with 1 million Afghans who live within Iran. And they not very publicly, but they mention that from time to time. And there are like 30,000 Afghans already being transported by the Iranian regime to the borders or let go, let's say. So it's a threat that they know works. But
they would need to go through Turkey.
Yeah, but that is enough, to transport them to Turkey. And then there's the political game with Erdogan, who also has an interest to say, either we contain them and you give us money and you deal with us or not. And then
this weaponization of migration is a hot topic these days. We remember how so-called President Lukashenko in Belarus tried to weaponize migration.
Exactly.
We see that apparently Russia is trying to control some of the migration flows in Africa as it expands its influence in Africa. So this is not surprising that a regime such as Iran's regime is trying to do the same.
Yeah, they did that already in 2015, by the way, when they saw that it has a huge impact on the political stability as well of democracies. And this is when they learned that this could be a potential weapon to weaponize refugees.
And it's, again, not surprising that they're having some sort of cooperation with the European far right that is against migration. So it's about creating divisions and polarizing.
And also with the far left in Germany, actually. We have far left figures like Sarah Wagenknecht who capitalize on saying we need to close our borders and we need to be strict. But on the point of learning, it seems that still Germany is learning very, very slowly. It learned very slowly towards Russia. It was very, very slow to impose sanctions. It still doesn't deliver all of the weapons that Ukraine needs. And it is the same actually with the Iranian regime. Germany, France and the UK are still in the JCPOA and the atomic deal. So they haven't left it. It's still in place. They're still negotiating with the Iranians, although the Russians are at the same table and openly say that they're going to use the deal to circumvent sanctions. This is what the Russian media mediator said. So it's high time to impose sanctions, but they still won't do it. And then there's the same problem like with the Russians. Most of the families of the Iranian representatives live in the West. So there are quite a few families of known Iranian representatives who are based in Germany. Their daughters and sons study here. They buy shares of companies. They buy equity. And that could be a weapon, yeah? Because now the population of Iran can't travel. They very, very often don't get visa, but the regime representatives are free to travel. So it would be easy to at least stop the visa, stop the travel.
But would it
from
hurt?
Iran.
This is a question, because if we look at Russia, for example, they wouldn't really care if those sanctions against individuals were imposed, because, well, they can always move to some other countries, to Saudi Arabia, to some Asian countries. Would it really hurt for Iranians officials to have their families sanctioned?
Yeah, they wouldn't want to move to Saudi Arabia because they live here, because they want to live without headscarves, they want to go out dancing, they want to dance to music. All that is forbidden in Iran. It's now a little bit more allowed in Saudi Arabia, but it's still not the same like living in a Western country and living freely. They want to live free. They want to live the exact opposite lives of Iranians living in Iran. And I think it would hurt the individual families and thereby pressure the Iranian representatives to curb.
And my final question is about what the West can do better when facing a challenge from Iran, and especially Iran cooperating with authoritarian regimes such as Russia. We recently heard about the deal, Iranian and Russian deal about drones, Iranian drones, that were quite harmful, to say the least, to the Ukrainian army and to the Ukrainian civil population. What the West can do about Iran? You already mentioned these probable sanctions on individuals, but what else?
Well, one of the things is with sanctions, the only reason why the system to circumvent sanctions works so well is because they're not thoroughly being investigated and implemented. So the first thing would be to really implement sanctions thoroughly, to impose strict sanctions, but then also to follow up and to really make sure that Iran is keeping within the line of those sanctions. At the moment, there's no real investigation. I mean, if a bank is caught, a Western bank, most of the time they pay a fine. It's calculated within their business program, and that's it. That is not going to help. So we really have to not only put sanctions in place, but to follow through. And this is the same with all of the policies towards Iran and Russia. It's the will to really, really take a stance and to do what you say. And that is lacking in the West. And I think it's lacking, and would be the most important lesson to learn, because people still think that if you talk to them, if you talk to Putin, if you talk to the Ayatollahs of the Iranian regime, they somehow will listen to reason, and they just don't. I mean, Putin just gave a speech which was quite crazy, catering to the global South in some strange way, but also doing some other things. I mean, nobody in their right mind could say that's the same person. But he means what he's saying, and you better listen to him because he's going to do something about it. And he said that he will attack Ukraine, and he's doing it. And the Iranian regime is doing the same thing. For example, one of the Iranian leaders was saying, we're going to develop nuclear weapons. Nobody can stop us. So listen to them and then work against it. Don't think just by talking to somebody they will change. They're not going to change. And they said it time and again, they're not going to change. So what they see it as a weakness, if we comply to if we try again and again to do deals which then are being broken and there are no consequences, why should they think that we mean what we say? So the West has to really become strict. And one of the most valuable lessons is to learn that they not only mean what they say, but they see democracies as a threat. Because the democracies, a free world, is the biggest threat to them, because then their own populations can see what life they're missing out. They can see that there's an alternative. And this will stay a threat. So if you want to live free, then you have to defend democracies. And this is the biggest lesson that we have to learn.
And these current protests in Iran, do you think they are somehow linked to the understanding of the Iranian society, of the Iranian people, that there is a chance to be free, there is a chance to live a better life in a more democratic society?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the interesting thing is, it's not that it just flared up. There have been protests since 40 years, again and again. One of the biggest was in 2019, when the regime killed within 3 days more than 1,000 people to suppress the protest. And of course, it's also motivated by economic hardship and so on, but mostly it's motivated because people want to have their rights. And if you see that there is a women's movement within Iran that lasted for 40 years, and they have contacts to women's rights advocates in the West, not only to Masih Alinejad, who was very famous, but also to several Iranian dissidents in Germany. And the exchange was always there, and they organized themselves very well, and they really want to live a free life. And a large part of the Iranian population is quite secular. We don't know how much of them want to live, but at least they want to shed these hard imposed restrictions that they live under now. So I think there's a chance, and I think if it fails this time, the regime will face protests again in 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and again, until the regime will be gone. So the days of the regime are numbered. So I think it will be successful. I mean, they will have to step down at some point, because the Iranian population doesn't want to take it anymore.
Thank you for this very insightful and interesting conversation, Rebecca.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.